Awesome. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Johanna Hussey. I am the manager of the Women's Launchpad, and I'd like to welcome you all to Beating Burnout 101 wellness webinar with coaching counselor Nikolai Blinnow. So for a little housekeeping before we get started, all lines are muted to minimize background noise, and the session is being recorded. To ask questions, please use the chat feature. And lastly, please do whatever you need to feel comfortable in this space. These are hard, messy times, and we want to take a moment to let ourselves settle in and be present. So with that intention set, let's get started. Welcome, Nikolai.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me, and welcome to Beating Burnout 101. As Johanna already shared, I am a licensed mental health counselor, and I'm also a coach who specializes in helping really driven, hardworking, performance-oriented women prevent and recover from burnout. So it's a topic that I'm really passionate about. You will learn it's something that is also near and dear to my heart because of my own experiences. And my goal for all of you here today is to start giving you practical strategies so that you can just understand a little bit more about what burnout is. So you can recognize what warning signs that you should be watching for, and you can walk away from today having some strategies that you can begin implementing right away to help yourself manage stress more effectively and be less susceptible to burning out. As Johanna already mentioned, we'll definitely be having questions at the end. So as you're listening to me, if any questions pop up in your mind, please feel free to just type them into the chat feature. And at the end, Johanna will be helping me moderate those, and we'll make sure that all of your questions get answered. Before we want to jump in, I do want to echo what Johanna said. I'm very grateful that you are all here. I think a lot of people have had their routines thrown off. A lot of people are feeling just a slight sense of being unsettled. There's a lot of uncertainty out in the world. And actually, as I was waiting for you all to jump on, I was just reading an article on grief and how as a larger community, there's a strong sense of anticipatory grief being experienced right now because of all the uncertainty. So I really hope that you take a moment to just pause and show yourself some gratitude for making the time to be here today. It might sound simple, but it's really easy to get distracted by other things. So I think the fact that you're here is lovely and is just showing that you really want to prioritize yourself and your self-care. With that said, okay, let's just jump right into it. And as I mentioned, if you have questions, type them right into the chat and we'll be happy to follow up with them at the end. We're going to be talking about what I'm calling Beating Burnout 101, which is just an introduction to the concept of burnout. And if we need to dig deeper, we can do that in the Q&A. And I also have my contact information at the end if people want to contact me about more specifics. So to start, I want to just define burnout. It's a term that historically we used to only hear in the medical field. So burnout is a term that was used for a long time. I believe we started seeing the term burnout being thrown around the 1970s to describe feeling fatigued or just feeling overworked in the medical profession. So it's something that originally you would see in professions like doctors, therapists, and social workers. But what they have found, nurses as well, but what they have found is as time has progressed, as technology has evolved, as society has shifted, that burnout is actually really trickling out into the general population. And one reason that I became interested in doing burnout education and prevention is because I personally feel like it's such a disservice that people like me who do this for a living, I received a lot of training in my graduate coursework about recognizing and preventing burnout. So I received a lot of coaching about how to recognize that. And in the work that I've done, I've really realized how little the rest of you know about burnout and how to recognize it. And so I think it's important that we really start to spread the word so that we can all take better care of ourselves, and that the tools that I'm giving you today are not just accessible to people in the helping professions, they're accessible to all of us. And basically, to give you an oversimplified definition of burnout, it really is just the mind and body's response to chronic stress. It's basically your body's way of saying that there's too much going on right now and your body needs to go into self-preservation mode. We'll follow up on what the warning signs are so you can learn more about that. But I want to talk about what it is and why it's important. So why you should care. I know you all are preparing to graduate, hopefully within the next year or so. Some of you may, as you start to listen to my talk, recognize that maybe you are burnt out or have been burnt out in the past. But even if that is or isn't the case, one thing I've seen in my work as a therapist and coach is that burnout, when left unchecked, can really, really sneak up on you, and it can really negatively impact your life and your career. I've seen it manifest in extreme cases where clients have had to, depending on where they're at in life, either take leaves of absence from school, or I've even had to provide my clients with leaves of absence from work in their careers. I don't think it always has to get to that point, but I also think in less extreme cases, when we're just not sure about how to manage our stress, even if it doesn't get to that place, it can certainly impede our ability to function at our highest potential. And I know when I've worked with clients and I've seen them progress in their stress management and their boundary setting and learning strategies to just really, prevent themselves from burning out, they experience more fulfillment in their jobs or at school. When they're in their careers, they tend to progress more quickly once they learn how to break the burnout cycle and speak up for themselves and meet their needs. They tend to get advancements at work or raises and just feel like, they're not hitting the ceiling where they're feeling stuck and they want to get further and they can't. Because burnout, unfortunately, it's something that comes up when we're actually really driven, so we can get stuck in a cycle of wanting to achieve and be where we want to be. And that same part of us that actually leads us to be very successful in our careers is also the same part of us that can at times, when we're not aware, work against us and get in our own way. And for those of you who are preparing to be graduating soon, I certainly don't want that for any of you. And I want you to start thinking of all of these things ahead of time. So how does it affect you? How does burnout hurt you? I talked a little bit about that already, sharing some client examples, but here are some of the other ways where burnout can really manifest. Burnout, when people are feeling really, really burnt out, a very common sign that someone's burnt out is feeling more cynical. So if you're normally feeling like you're a more upbeat, positive person, and then all of a sudden you're feeling like, oh, I just don't have that pep in my step the way that I normally do. I'm not as excited about school or about my friends or about the priorities that I invest my time in. That might be a sign that you're sort of starting on the spectrum to burnout. And connected to that is this lack of motivation, feeling like you know what you should be doing, but sometimes finding it difficult to give yourself that little push to do what actually needs to get done. Other common signs of burnout or things that people see and how it affects them is losing time due to illness. I've already talked about, I've definitely seen this with my clients where they come to me and they haven't been on top of their burnout, and now they're in my office and they're out on sick leave from school, or sick leave from work, or if they're not on a formal leave, they're definitely noticing they might be skipping more classes than they normally like to, or they may be procrastinating on their assignments a little bit and making excuses to their professors, and just generally feeling like they are losing time. Connected to this, loss or a decrease in effectiveness and productivity. When you are burnt out, the internal pressure that we put on ourselves as performance-oriented people is usually to do more, or to work harder, or to basically tell yourself to kind of like buck up and push through it. But what ends up happening when you start on the burnout spectrum is all of that pushing actually can cause you to be less effective and less productive. And then finally, there can certainly be an increased risk of conflict. And that's because when we're burnt out, if you think of the definition of burnout as being your body's and your mind's response to chronic stress, and your body's way of saying like, put the brakes on, it's too much. When we're in that place, we're naturally more anxious. We're naturally a little bit more emotionally raw. Our attention spans are not what they normally are. And so it's easier for us to be less patient with people, to be snappier with people, and to just not get along as well with people, either in our personal or our professional lives. And I've already kind of touched on this. Why should you worry now? This is just my own personal belief. There's a cliche, the best defense is a good offense, which means, you know, basically be willing to like take the attack, right? Don't wait until burnout comes into your life to start trying to figure out how to tackle it. I've shared that I've seen people who have not been so proactive. They have waited, and all of a sudden now they've lost valuable time at school or work. I personally feel there's a better way. And so if you know your burnout warning signs and you can proactively manage your stress, then you're able to save yourself from lost opportunities, from lost relationships, and just what we call in the therapy world lost functionality. That basically just means you're not operating at your full potential, right? So if you can worry about this now, you prevent yourself in the future operating at less than 100% of what you're capable of. And so my story, I think it's nice to hear a little bit of personal experience. I've always been a very driven, performance-oriented person. I think part of it is just my cultural background. My dad is Russian and German, so we've always been taught to work really, really, really hard. And on top of it, in my family, I was the first one to go to college. So there were a lot of expectations placed on my shoulders, and I had some sort of economic barriers that I was really always very eager to overcome. And as a result, my style that I developed in life has been a very problem-solving oriented style. So if I see a problem, I want to attack it, I want to fix it, I want to overcome it. And that is both a blessing and a curse. Because for me, what I've learned is sometimes I can be so driven and so forward thinking and so willing to tackle my problems head on that I can forget to slow down and practice my own self-care and manage my own boundaries, either within myself emotionally or with the people in my life, personally or professionally. And for me, how I realized, even as a therapist who has graduate level training in burnout, I came to realize that still I was leaving myself susceptible to burnout and having burnout flare-ups because I was at one point in a mental health agency setting where I was a clinician and I advocated to get a promotion. And so I was a therapist who then also was supervising other therapists and case managers and also handling all the crisis at my agency, while at the same time working to start up my own business, which is where I'm at now. And I started getting these really horrible tension headaches. And I say started, but really I've had tension headaches sort of on and off my whole life. And as I learned more about burnout, I learned to recognize that my tension headaches were very much correlated with how burnt out I was feeling. So now I've learned to listen to my body and recognize, like, the very beginning of a tension headache is a sign that I am taking on too much or I need to slow down. And I just, through that experience, became really passionate about making sure that I educate other people about knowing their warning signs and saving themselves from unnecessary physical health problems or pain that you don't have to go through, because why go through it if you don't have to? And here's some facts, okay? Because I want you to know, like, it's nice to hear my personal story. It's all well and good, but also, you know, you want to know how this applies out in the general world. I am not alone in feeling burnt out. So statistics show that it's almost 2/3 of workers. So in a survey of corporate employees, I think it was 74% of people mentioned that they felt burnt out at least some of the time. And then 1 in 4 employees in that same survey said that they actually felt burnt out most of the time. But if you think about that, that's actually a pretty decent number. That's about, 25% of people who are working are feeling burnt out most of the time. And I also wanted to share, because those of you, you're kind of in the tail end of the millennial generation, you may or may not have heard this, but they're actually coining the term that millennials are being called the burnout generation, because people who were born and grew up in the late 80s, 90s, and early 2000s are just susceptible to a lot of factors that make us really extra ripe and susceptible to burnout, and I'll talk about that. And also the World Health Organization, which basically they're responsible for what's called the International Classification of Disease, or the ICD. They publish an ICD every few years, and the newest ICD is actually going to have burnout as an official diagnosis, which was never the case before. It used to be that you would have to be diagnosed with something like anxiety or depression. But now they're recognizing that burnout is in and of itself its own diagnosis and its own problem. So I think that shows that it's something that we, are going to be coping with for a while and need to continue to know how to address. So as for millennials and burnout, why is it that we think millennials are even more susceptible to burnout than previous generations? Well, I did some research, and also I have my own thoughts and hypotheses doing the work that I do. But we are the first generation that really grew up with internet and technology like social media and smartphones and tablets. So we, more than any generation previously, have developed this sort of expectation that we can just be available all the time. And for people who were born, before the internet officially came out in the 90s, there were these built-in breaks from work. And also, I think for those of you, right, who are in school, I think the same thing. It was like you go to college, you come home, you work on your homework, you go to school the next day, you follow up on it. But now, because of email and cell phones and Blackboard or whatever digital platforms you're using for school, we're able to be available all of the time, which has its pros and its cons. It allows us to take our learning and our work everywhere, and it also eliminates those breaks that we used to just naturally get, where we would have time to unwind and to disengage, to rest and recuperate for the next day. And then also, in just brushing up on my own research, I found this to be interesting. Millennials, and this makes sense to me, we were the first generation. So for a long time, and this is based on the experience of the United States. So let me just say that. But for a long time in the United States, each generation was sort of progressively, economically, succeeding and growing in comparison to the generation previously. And millennials are the first generation in a really, really long time where that hasn't been the case. And those of you, who are on the call today, you're a little bit on like the younger end of the millennial spectrum, but I know from my work in therapy and coaching, I have a lot of clients who are in their mid-20s, who basically were in college, I guess like in the 2010s maybe, and basically are saying they felt like they built their whole life with a certain expectation, and then in 2008 we had a big economy shift, and there were a lot of people who felt like the goals that they were working towards, they didn't come to fruition, or they didn't really get the outcomes that they were expecting. And I think that we're in a better place now, but I still think that that experience from a cultural standpoint has left a little bit of a mark on us. And I see this all the time with my clients. I put it here, we're the first generation in a while where people feel, I put quotes, behind, because, if we look at previous generations, they were maybe starting families younger, or they were buying houses younger, or they were paying off their debt faster, they were out on their own more quickly. And so that can affect a mindset and leave you prone to feeling like you need to work harder, when really that's a broader social issue that's beyond your control, but certainly it affects you. So part of me getting out and spreading the word is I'm hoping to help all of you shift the paradigm by helping you learn the strategies so you can cope with your own stress, and you can set healthy boundaries in your own life, so that you can sort of cope better with both the internal factors that might leave you vulnerable to burnout and the external factors that you're just forced to cope with because that is life. But in learning to be better at recognizing your own warning signs and to cope with stress and to burnout, then you also all have the opportunity to act as leaders in terms of stress management and emotional resiliency, by just letting the way that you conduct yourself allow you to be role models for practicing effective self-care and taking good care of your health, and to balance your individual self-care with broader goals of hopefully, enacting systemic change where we can create a world that is making us less vulnerable. And that starts with also just learning how to speak up for your own needs, with you being educated and being willing to educate other people. Not in a judgmental or dogmatic way, but just making sure that people know about this stuff. So it doesn't have to be big though, all right? So trying to tackle burnout sort of in your own life and in a broader scale, it really just starts with you in learning to take better care of yourself and knowing what your burnout warning signs are. So I mentioned in worst case scenarios, some of the things that you might see if you're starting to burn out, like feeling more cynical, feeling lack of motivation, feeling like your time management is off, or you're less effective or productive, or you're at increased risk of conflict. But there are a lot of smaller burnout warning signs that you can learn to watch for. And they basically fall into 3 categories. So you can have physical symptoms of burnout, you can have emotional symptoms of burnout, and you can have mental symptoms of burnout. Physical symptoms are things like feeling really fatigued, having insomnia or trouble sleeping. A lot of my clients, when they start to get really stressed, they'll have gastrointestinal issues. I think it's the National or the American Association for Anxiety actually says that gastrointestinal issues are the #1 symptom of anxiety. Other things that you might see are things like headaches, body aches. So a lot of my clients will notice they hold tension in their lower back or their upper back. For me, it was tension headaches, which actually start in your upper back and then spread up and over into a full headache. And just maybe feeling like you're getting sick a lot more frequently, you have a lack of appetite, or even your cravings for foods might change, right? So if you're normally a really healthy eater and you notice you're craving really rich foods or really sugary foods, that's actually your body's stress response. When our bodies get really stressed out, they go into survival mode. And when we're in survival mode, the things that we crave the most are carbs or starches and sweets. So if you notice a change in your appetite or your cravings, that could be a burnout warning sign for you. For emotional symptoms, it's things like feeling anxious, feeling sad, feeling irritable, feeling detached from things that you normally care about, and maybe just feeling like you want to be alone more, or you just don't want to be around people quite as much, like you need more personal space. And then for mental symptoms of burnout, these ones are things that people sometimes don't recognize as much as burnout symptoms, but once they learn about them, they're like, oh yeah, I'm burnt out all the time. But worrying more, forgetfulness is a big one. If you're having trouble remembering where you put things, or you're having trouble keeping track of your assignments or paperwork or anything like that, that could absolutely be a burnout warning sign. Having trouble managing your time, so not necessarily from a low energy standpoint, but just feeling like you're having trouble doing the actual management of your time, not being able to concentrate, feeling confused more easily or overwhelmed more easily, and just having trouble getting things done. So that's a lot, but I want you to be able to hear all of them and think if any of them resonate with you. So if you notice these things, right? So if you're hearing this and you're like, oh no, either I am burnt out, or maybe I have been burnt out in the past and I definitely don't want to go there again, then the good news is that there are things that you can start doing right now. And when I went through my own brain and I really racked, like, what are the top 3 things that I recommend to the clients that I work with? These are the things that I think really rose to the surface and I also felt were pretty practical to implement. So they are using your values as a guide, stop being so good at tolerating stress, which is a really hard one for people, and investing in your emotional savings account. So when it talks to using your values as a guide, you might be thinking like, what is that? What does that mean? My first recommendation to clients is to do an inventory of your values. We feel burnt out when we are over prioritizing the things that we should be doing, and we are not also doing a good amount of things that we genuinely want to be doing. And those are the things that come from our values. I think that examples sometimes make things more easy and concrete to understand. So I'll share, I worked with a client, and this was manifesting for them because they were feeling really burnt out, and they were someone who was in their mid to later 20s. They had already been getting started in their career, and they were really into practicing good self-care. So they were eating healthy, they were going to the gym, they got interested in weightlifting, and that was something that they felt was really, really, really healthy for them. And they were spending so much time trying to make time for their health and wellness routine. And that's not to say that that isn't important and you shouldn't do that. But we did a values inventory, and what we realized for that person is that they actually really, really valued making a difference. That was something that was really, really important to them. And they were actually working in a school system at the time, and they were feeling very ineffective in their work and feeling like they were not working well with their administration. And so, to oversimplify it, they felt really powerless when a value that they had was to feel powerful so that they could go forth into the world and make a difference in people's lives and help them. So they were spending so much time on these little day-to-day things of like working out and eating healthy, when on a deeper level, their values really were not being satiated or satisfied. So instead of focusing so much on working out and eating healthy, we made a plan for them to actually figure out how they could improve their situation at work, how they could feel like they were working more effectively. And they called a meeting with their administration. They shared their concerns, and they all got on the same page about what they thought was going to be helpful. And they realized that in order to protect themselves from burnout, they really had to make sure that value that they had about making a difference was continually being satisfied, so that as long as they were at this employer, they had to keep, staying on top of their administrators and their work, and really just acting more as an advocate. That's what was really missing from their lives. So if anyone has questions about this, I know I'm telling you to do this, but it's also hard to think about what your values are. You can start by just Googling a values list. You'll find a bunch of them out on the internet, and look at those. And then I always tell people, check off everything that's important to you, and then really force yourself to say which one or two are most important right now, and see if your daily life is reflecting those. And if it's not, then ask yourself, how can I bring more of that into my life? And if you have trouble finding a values list, or if you want to see the one that I use, you can email me and I can send you the one that I go over with my clients. And the next strategy I recommend is to stop being so good at tolerating stress. So one thing that I teach people pretty early on is that when we have a problem, we basically only have 4 options to solve it, but there's a million different nuances of how we can solve that. Like once we choose one of those options, we can solve the problem so we don't have to deal with it anymore. We can change or regulate our emotional response to the problem. So if the outward problem is still there, but it doesn't have any more power over me, we can tolerate it, or we can just do nothing and let the problem continue to exist. And I see sometimes people fall into that tolerating problem-solving strategy more than they need to, or they use tolerating when really they should be actually fixing something, or they should be changing how they feel about it. And an example of that, again, because I think examples are helpful, is I had a client who came to me once and really just over and over again was saying how they wanted to learn how to manage their emotions better at work, and they were just feeling cynical, and they wanted to have better and more positive personal relationships, and so that's why they came to me to work with me. And so they needed to learn what they thought was how to just tolerate the emotions that they were feeling without taking them out on other people. Now, once we again started to unpack what was going on and understand what was going on, we actually realized that that person was feeling really overlooked at work for opportunities. They were seeing other people at work who were less qualified be given, not necessarily promotions, but they were giving perks, and they were being given opportunities to do really cool projects that this person really was envious of, and they wanted to bring that into their own life. And if I had worked with them to keep tolerating things, then everything would still say exactly the same. When instead, what this client realized that they needed to do was, instead of tolerating, they had to figure out how they could fix the problem. And similar to the other example I gave, for this person, it came down to advocating, but instead of advocating for the people they worked with or advocating for population, this client realized that they really needed to do a better job of advocating for themselves, going to their employer and speaking up and sharing how they were feeling and what they needed, and basically ask for more opportunities and problem solve with their employer how they could get those opportunities while still also satisfying the requirements of their job that obviously their employer wanted them to be able to perform. And then the last strategy is to invest in your emotional savings account. These are the things that I think of as more traditional self-care, the little day-to-day practices that help buffer us against stress. So I think a lot in metaphor and analogy. I think it makes it easier for our brains to understand things. So what I tell my clients is to think of your brain and your emotional well-being as a bank account. Every time you deposit something positive into your bank account, no matter how big or how small, that helps develop your resiliency against stress and burnout. So then, if life throws you a curveball, it's less likely to overdraft you. And these deposits are things that we should be doing every single day. I actually recommend to my clients every single day, you should be doing one thing that you need to do and one thing that you want to do. And it can be something fun, like, I want to plan a vacation, or I want to, I'd say go out to eat or go to the movies, but none of us are doing that right now. So maybe I want to order, they have all the subscription boxes now, right? So now you can even order, I saw there was a foodie box where they mail you a box every month with all this cool foodie stuff, so you can make new recipes and learn new things. So it can be something like that, or it can be as simple as, for me, I always joked when I was at my mental health agency and I was supervising, I lived near a vegan bakery, and they had these Mexican chocolates that were really good, and I loved them. And if I was starting to feel a little burnt out and I needed a deposit, I would just stop and get an iced coffee and one of those little Mexican chocolates. And I would joke with my staff and say, that's how you know if I'm stressed out, if I come in with chocolate. Just such a stereotype. But it can be little things like that. Another client that I worked with was living at home with a family member, and they just sometimes would get into it and feel burnt out or overwhelmed by each other. And so what they did to invest in their emotional savings account was once a week, they started a routine where instead of going straight home from work, they would go to a local Starbucks or a local like Barnes and Noble where they had a coffee shop and a bookstore and just sit for a little bit, you know, read and rest and relax and drink their coffee or their tea just to get a break and a little buffer before they walked into the potential stress at home. So to summarize, right, everything we covered, which I'm aware has been a lot, burnout is super common. It's especially common for people who are in their 20-somethings or their early 30-somethings. It can certainly impact your success. It can have a negative impact on your health, but it is beatable, and it's best when you sort of come at it in a proactive way. So that I really think making stress management and learning strategies like the 3 that I just covered is a really good priority for all of you to be doing right now. And I think will certainly set you up for success as you start to transition into your careers. So with that, I will leave it up to questions if anyone has questions, and Johanna will moderate that for us.
Nikolai, thank you so much for these gems and for guiding us through all things about burnout, how to avoid burnout, and really how to take care of ourselves. I personally appreciated you talking about your emotional savings account, doing one thing you need to do and one thing you want to do. So thank you for that reminder. That's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
So you talked a lot about staying motivated and things that you do to, you know, not have burnout. But can you tell us what specifically are the differences between burnout from academic versus professional work, since, you know, really our listeners are college students?
Yeah, so I think honestly, the mechanisms that are gonna make you burnt out are gonna be the same. I actually think those of you, all of you who are in college right now, I think you are a little bit buffered from burnout because one thing that the research has shown is there's internal factors that leave us susceptible to burnout, just how we handle stress, what our personality traits are, but also that there's external factors that make the risk of feeling burnt out even higher. And those are things like feeling support or lack of support from whatever institution that you're involved in. So reflecting back on my own experience being in college, I feel like there's a level of support that you hopefully have from your professors or from staff or from programs like this that Johanna is moderating for all of you, that hopefully will make your burnout not as extreme as it could be once you enter into the corporate career world, where that level of support I've seen can be so variable. There's such variance, which is one reason I feel like it's good for you to tackle it early. And I think when you're burning out academically, it just might not be as extreme. So I would really look for things like just feeling like you're having trouble motivating yourself, feeling like you're more fatigued and tired, maybe feeling like you just don't really want to be around your friends, or things that you normally would want to go out and do, you're not feeling like you want to go out and do anymore. I think those are the things that you're probably going to be more likely to see. Although in extreme cases, I have seen college students who do need to go on a leave or who are actively missing classes. I think for academia, you have some support built in that hopefully will make it less likely that you'll see the extreme sort of expressions of burnout. But I urge you all to start paying attention to it now, because I want you to have the tools so that when you graduate and you're in your careers, this is an issue that you've already tackled up front.
So that's a great segue into the next question is how can you build healthy habits? So, you know, you mentioned people going to Starbucks or doing what they need to just take a break. Of course, with the way things are right now, where a lot of us are in our homes, and so we're not going out. So, you know, when we feel stress coming on, and I think particularly right now, you know, we're feeling the stress of everything that's going on in the world and something that we can't control. But then we also have our own stresses of life. We have our stresses with academics. And now some of us are with family members that we aren't spending a lot of time with. And now we're with them like every day because we're all inside. So when you feel stress coming on, what are ways to deal with it and to kind of prevent it? So, you know, just being mindful that we're limited into where we can go, and, you know, so what kind of things can we do at home today to help create healthy habits?
Yeah, I will say I'm a big fan, although I threw a lot at you because I want you all to have as much as possible. I'm also a big fan of starting small and keeping things as simple as possible. So there are these things, you guys can Google them if you would like to, called cornerstone habits. That's one thing that you can start looking into. But it's this idea that certain things that we do, they don't have to be really big, but once we start one small habit, it makes it easier to build upon and then add something else and add something else and add something else. So examples of cornerstone habits are things like drinking a glass of water first thing in the morning, or making sure you're washing your face before bed. Really looking at these tiny little habits that you can start bringing into your day-to-day life that sort of either set your day up for success or wrap it up in a way that feels like you're taking care of yourself. That is definitely one thing that you can start thinking about implementing. I also find with my clients, this isn't for everybody, but there's a good amount of research out there that says the more you can sort of get your habits started earlier in the day, the more you can start your day out with a healthy habit, the more likely that is to kind of follow through the rest of your day. So I recommend a book to my clients sometimes. It's called The Miracle Morning. One of my clients actually told me she found a PDF of it online for free. So if you Google it, you can find it for free. Some of it's a little like heavy on the life coachy stuff, but I think the principles are all valid. And it's a simple, straightforward guide to help you create a morning routine that works for you. I do a version of what I call my miracle morning, and it involves every day I do meditation. I do a little bit of affirmation, and then I do just a couple minutes of reading, but reading that feels like it's positively influencing me, reading about a positive subject matter, like a self-development work or something that feels good about what's going on in the world. And then I do a little bit of journaling or reflection. So you don't have to do all of those things, but I think just giving you some ideas and spitballing out some things that I do or some of my clients do, think about one habit that you can bring into your morning routine and just start with adding that in. And then once that starts to feel like it's up and running, you've gotten the ball rolling, then you can think about piling additional healthy habits on top of that. But what I found, and actually there's a psychotherapist in Cambridge who's also a yoga teacher who wrote a book on yoga for anxiety and depression, and she's working on a second book on intuitive awareness and emotional intelligence. And in her book, she talks about change. And one thing that she says she's found from her personal experience and also in doing her own research is that when we make really big changes, when we say we're going to do these 5 things all at once, those are the changes that actually don't stick. But when we start small and we make tiny changes and we build on them, those are the changes that we actually stick to and end up being more long-term. So sometimes I feel like we create a lot of pressure on ourselves to do it all, but start small. Just pick one thing, maybe 2, and trust that like that's actually better and will help you succeed more than trying to make this big, broad self-care change right away.
That's awesome, Nikolai. Thank you. I know just for my own personal self, a healthy habit that I've been trying to build in as I've been working from home is just to take m- moving breaks. So setting a goal to get up and move and stretch. Take a 10-minute walk around my neighborhood, or just do whatever to be able to distance myself from my virtual space and my reality. But it feels so good when I even just to get out and walk and see the sunshine. It just feels awesome.
And I'll say, just piggybacking on that, you'll notice where I'm sitting right now. This is my most comfortable space, but I also have a home office that I sometimes work in. But since I've been working from home even more so than usual, one thing I noticed is my office chair actually isn't that comfortable. And so by the end of the day, I end up with these like really minor backaches or headaches. Whereas if I sit in this kitchen chair, which doesn't look really comfortable, it's actually much more comfortable for my body, and sitting here for long periods of time feels better. So sometimes even little changes like that, paying attention to like where you're doing your work, if there are different rooms in your house that feel more conducive or less conducive to stress, or like where you're sitting, even like the chair that you're sitting in, if you're sitting there all day and you notice that it's making you feel uncomfortable, well then like find a different place to sit.
That's great. Thank you, Nikolai. A similar question along those lines is, so we talked about some things that we can control in terms of managing our stress and burnout. What about when we get to a point of maintaining boundaries with other people and ensuring that they respect them? So kind of the difference between the stuff that we can control versus stuff we can't control. We can't control other people not necessarily respecting our space or attitudes and whatnot. So what do you advise around that?
Yeah, I think it's just a constant process. I think boundaries are things that we have to always be checking in with for ourselves, and also assessing those and potentially communicating about those to other people. I have like a bunch of strategies that I recommend to clients when I'm working with them, but I'd say one that people really love is an acronym that you all can remember. If you want to establish your boundaries or advocate for your boundaries with a family member or a friend, or even, in the future, a colleague or a coworker, the acronym to remember is FAST. And that stands for be fair. Be fair to yourself and be fair to the other person. Don't over apologize. Apologize if you feel like you've actually done something wrong and you need to apologize. But sometimes we apologize out of habit for setting boundaries, when if it's an effective boundary and it's a respectful boundary, we don't have to apologize for setting it. Stick to your values. So that comes back to the values piece, knowing what your values are and making sure that you're living in line with those. And you're also, when you're communicating to other people, expressing those. And the T stands for be truthful, right? So just be truthful and honest with what you're saying, and be truthful and honest in terms of how you're conducting yourself too, in terms of your demeanor. Be authentic and grounded.
Perfect. Thank you. One question that has also come in is from somebody who is identifying as a senior. And so she's saying that being relocated and stopped short in the middle of her final semester has left her feeling less than motivated to complete her work and to continue the job search. How do you recommend, excuse me, how do you recommend that we make the most of this time and harness our skills to continue growing as learners, as women, as well as staying positive about future and about ourselves?
I mean, first I'll say I do not blame you at all for feeling the struggle with motivation. I can only imagine how just abrupt this whole experience must feel for you, especially being a senior and you're already in this point where you're preparing to transition, which is exciting, but also uncertain and scary. But now we have this like extra thing that we're all coping with. So my advice would be like, give yourself your space to like let yourself feel frustrated and uncertain, and trust that you can feel those things without actually giving into them, or giving up. Like you can feel unmotivated and you can still kind of push through. Just because you feel unmotivated and you feel the urge that you just like sometimes you're questioning why keep trying, that doesn't mean that you actually have to stop trying. They can both coexist. An exercise that I give, it's hard to describe this over the phone or the Zoom portal, but if you've ever done a pros and cons exercise, I do with my clients what's called a 4-pointed pros and cons. So if you draw a box and then you draw like a cross in the middle, so you end up with 4 boxes. At the top, write pros and cons. And then on the left-hand side, you write down whatever your urge is that you're feeling right now. So it kind of sounds like your urge at times, which is definitely understandable, is like, I just want to give up and stop trying, right? Like all of this stuff is happening. It's so frustrating. It's like scary and uncertain. So write like give up and stop trying. And on the bottom, write like keep pushing through and keep trying. And then give yourself space to look at the pros, like look at the benefits of if you were to give up and stop trying. Doesn't mean you're going to actually give up and stop trying, but if you're having that urge, it's coming up for a reason, and it's actually more helpful to give yourself the space to acknowledge like what would be good about if I actually just threw my hands up in the air and said no more. But then look at what are the cons of doing that as well, and then follow that back around and look at the cons of continuing to push through, right? So in this time of uncertainty, if you keep trying to do your work, right? If you keep trying to stay positive and motivated, I think it's fair to say a downside of that is, especially right now, it takes a lot of effort. It can be really hard. It can be really draining to push yourself. But then look at what are the benefits if you keep pushing yourself, if you keep trying to stay on task towards your goals. I think most people would agree there's a lot of benefit that comes from that, because there's the potential for a lot of opportunity. If you can push through, you know, everything that you're going through right now, then this will all provide you with tools and resiliency that are going to serve you later on in life in your career. And I think most people that I work with, when they do that exercise, say that if they push through and they keep trying, that there's also sort of this sense of like inner pride or fulfillment that comes from overcoming and sticking through those challenges. So I would try that exercise. And again, have my email here. So if you want to see the actual worksheet that I give people, so you have the visual, you can email me and I'll give that to you.
Nikolai, thank you for that. I can piggyback too. I've been having this question keeps coming up recurringly in the Mentee office hours that I've been having with students. And what I've been trying to talk with students about is meeting yourself where you're at. And so kind of like where you were talking about building on small changes for long-term results, similar with your academics and with your job search is, you know, it feels really scary and it feels really big to be a senior right now and think about what you're going to do after May. So meet yourself where you're at and pace yourself and realize that you are not going to solve the stress in one day. So take a deep breath and say, okay, what's one thing that I can do today, right now? And, you know, maybe that is sending a couple of emails out, or maybe it's making a goal to put together your cover letter, resume, or to work on fine tuning that. For the mentees on the call, maybe it's making an appointment to meet with me for office hours, or meeting with Amy Ames for office hours, to talk through your professional toolkit. So the things that you can be doing little by little, and slowly tracking your progress, just recognizing that this is a marathon, it's not a sprint, and we got a long way to go. And so pacing yourself, meeting yourself where you're at, and celebrating yourself each day for the little things that you did, so before you go to bed, say, okay, what did I achieve today? And you just being proud of yourself for what you did do and honoring that, rather than getting overwhelmed about the things that you're really trying to achieve with your larger goals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll say the style of therapy that I'm trained in and that I pull a lot of my coaching from, it's called dialectical behavioral therapy. And one of the core components of the work I do is teaching people how to balance acceptance with change. And as part of that, one thing that I've learned doing this work is that acceptance actually has to come first. So we have to learn how to accept where we are at right now if we are going to be able to overcome and to push through the challenges. And to accept sort of the uncertainty of where we're at in life right now. It's not easy. Rationally, it's easy to say just practice acceptance and balance that with change. But I think so often we get focused on what we could be doing better or what needs to be happening differently, instead of starting from the acceptance place and trusting that if we accept ourselves, we accept what's happening, we accept our responses to that, then we can figure out how to move through and move forward.
That's beautiful, Nikolai. Thank you so much. So we are just at time. I don't know if you want to put up your next slide.
Oh, yes. So if anyone has questions, if you want any of the handouts that I'm referencing, or you just want to pick my brain about something a little bit further, that's my website. I do have a resources tab. I'm not the best at blogging, so there are some blog posts up there that might interest you if you want to check that out. But you can also absolutely email me, and I will respond back to your questions or with any of the materials that I'm referencing that you might want.
Awesome. Nikolai, thanks so much for hanging out with us today. It's been such a pleasure. I've learned so much, and I hope all of our listeners have as well. Again, this is being recorded, and we'll send out the recording to all participants. Thanks, Nikolai.
Awesome.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.